Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jenny and I am here to start my reading wrap-up for the month of November today. The first book that I finished in November was Jonny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. This was the book I read for the Skoden Readathon, which promotes Indigenous writers and literature, run by Kim from Native Lady Book Warrior. So, this is a novel. It is set in Manitoba, mostly either on the reserve that the main character Jonny Appleseed lives in, or in Winnipeg, which is the largest city in Manitoba. And it reads very much like a memoir. So I think if you like memoir, then you would most likely like this book. And I do like memoir, so I was, I found the format very readable. I think I would have preferred a tiny bit more plot. There wasn't a lot of plot in there, and the arc is basically starting you off when Jonny Appleseed needs to return home from the city because his stepfather has passed away. And the story, progresses, and he does end up going back to the reservation. But and that is one aspect, I think, of the narrative. So this idea of returning home after you've left and losing people you love when you're away, that's definitely one of the themes. But I would say that's a smaller theme in the grand themes of the book. One of the other really prominent themes is sex work, because Jonny Appleseed is a sex worker. He's a two-spirit, so a member of the LGBTQ community, but two-spirit is usually an Indigenous reference, and he is a sex worker, mostly cyber sex, so mostly webcam type work. And I think that what I found really powerful about this novel is that it depicts sex work with a lot of humility, a lot of compassion, and makes it a very everyday profession and gives it dignity. Because I think that sex work is very much presented in a derogatory way in our culture, and we're also conditioned in our culture to view sex work with judgment and with revulsion and a whole lots of other ways that we're trained to not accept it as a valid means of making a living. And I think that this book is very good at countering that narrative and giving you an example of a functioning human being who has chosen sex work as their profession. And so without judgment, without going into the morality of that and trying to make the story about the morality of that. It's not what this story is about. So I liked that. The story, I think, is also a love story, even though within the narrative there's some questioning about whether or not the main character feels love or understands love, or I do think it is a love story between Jonny Appleseed and his childhood friend. They grow up together. And it's also about the reality of growing up on a reservation, an Indigenous community, when you are a two-spirit person. So when you do not conform to the gender stereotypes and the gender roles that have been assigned in your community. So in that way, I think it's very relatable for anyone who's in the LGBT community, and also I think it's really relatable to anyone who's felt like an outsider growing up in their community, because I think it all relates. It's a very similar feeling, and I think that was really well relayed. But there's also deep love for him, for his grandmother and his mother. And so I feel like that love is a large part of the anecdotes that are told throughout the story, the vignettes of memory that are told throughout the story. I don't know if all of those vignettes needed to be in there. I feel like some of them felt like they were reiterating the same point. So if I was editing that, maybe I would have removed a few, just because to me, like, you don't need to keep saying the same thing in a different story. So it felt like that happened a little bit in the story, but overall, I really, really enjoyed the narrative, and I enjoyed how the story unfolded. And there were joyous moments. There were moments of fun and celebration, and then there were sad moments. It felt very full circle in terms of representing a full life and not just offering up one perspective on a life. So the sad parts or the happy parts or the hard parts or the painful parts. And I think it's also about pain. And I think there was some interesting vignettes that talked about pain in your body and embodying the embodiment of pain, which I found really interesting. And also obviously the kind of indigenous thread of Cree storytelling in there, that, loops to some legends within the culture, etc. So there was a lot there, and it's definitely worth. I listened to it, and it was narrated by Joshua Whitehead himself. So I thought that I liked hearing his voice tell the story. I think it really enriched my experience of listening to it. So that was my first finish of November, and I will check in again when I have another book. Hey everyone! Okay, so my second finish of November was H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald. This was the final read in my 5-star predictions for 2022 list. And I certainly enjoyed finally reading this book. It's been such a hyped memoir, mostly by Olive from a Book Olive, because I know she's mentioned it many times as her favorite memoir ever. And it just seems to be a book that came up again and again for people. I think it's interesting that this has been so lauded, because it's kind of a difficult subject matter for a lot of people, I think. Hunting as a occupation, as a pastime, is not something that is that straightforward. It's very complex. There's a lot of layers to it. And so that is obviously what this story is about. If you have not, for some reason, heard of this memoir, it is Helen MacDonald recounting her time training a goshawk. She's from England. She was a professor of literature. Always been interested in falconry since she was a child, so it's like a lifelong interest that which was interesting because she didn't really go into in this her previous experience with training, like with falconry. So she kind of shows us the beginning of it, like her childhood interest, and then she shows us the process of training Mabel, who was the goshawk that she got right after her father's death, like within weeks of her father dying. And the trauma and the grief that she's going through around her father's death is something that she kind of funnels into Mabel, who she names her goshawk. So you kind of, and she wove that quite brilliantly together, her grief and Mabel's training and the influences of how she trained Mabel. So she also talks a lot about falconry in literature, in British literature specifically, although she does bring in some other perspectives from different cultures as well, but it's mostly an England-based narrative. And T.B. White, is that what he... I just want to make sure I'm getting his initials. T.H. White, not T.B. White. That's another writer. T.H. White, who is not as famous, I think, a writer as T.B. White. And she goes quite in depth into his personal journey with his hawk and how the book that he wrote about that really influenced her. And so I think what she's doing, what I enjoyed that she did, was she brings you through her mindset as she is going through grief around her father's death, going through this existential crisis essentially about her own life and her own place in the world, and how she's trying to reconnect with herself and with this thing that she loves, which is falconry, and it's all woven quite well. Near the end, she went off a little bit into environmental and social kind of topics, which I found to be a little bit late in the narrative to introduce. You know, she was relating them to a specific experience with Mabel, and so I think that it did tie in, but it was a little bit of a leap to take us into a more broad socio-political, environmental discussion at that stage of the book, because we'd already been very focused inward on her experience, Mabel's experience, and then her feelings about her father. So I've read several memoirs that deal with the death of a father, and I would say she handled this one quite well, because she didn't go off into too much detail about her father. So this is a fine line for me. But if I was comparing it to, I think it's called 5 Years of Austen, or I think it's called 5 Years of Austen. I'll link it here. I listened to that earlier this year, and I can link the video as well down below, where I talk about my thoughts on my wrap up on it. But you know, whereas that memoir waxed poetic, got very convoluted about her father as a person. And so her emotions were all tied up in her father, and she told us too much about her father, and she got very sentimental, and it kind of lost the plot, the narrative, the thread got lost. I don't find Helen MacDonald did that. She stayed with like 3 or 4 key points of her father's personality and how they come up for her as she's going through these stages of grief. And she keeps it pretty to the point. So the only time that I find she digressed was in that chapter where she was talking about the environmental and social commentary. And I think I still think that what she was saying was very interesting and good. But I think it wasn't meant for this book. It should have been. And I think it's possible that she maybe wrote other essays in that area in her future book, because her next book, Vespers, I think it's called, is a book of essays. So she may have gone into that in that book, which is where it belongs. It didn't really fit with this. And I think that's all I have to say. You know, I think it was well written. I think it was, I certainly didn't know anything about falconry, didn't know anything about hawks, and know a lot more now. And I think that you could really feel the weight of her grief. You could feel her struggle to remain human, to remain connected to the outside world, her struggle with her mental health, her struggle, she did struggle with depression as she's going through this. And I thought that was very well handled, very well conveyed. And it felt very believable and very, poignant as an experience that most of us will go through at some point in our life, to varying degrees of what she went through. Not training a hawk, but losing a parent. So, yeah, I will check in again when I have another book to tell you about. Hi, everyone. Okay, So I finished Self-Portrait with Boy by Rachel Lyon last night, and this was my book club read with the Thrive Together Network. And I think this is a fantastic novel. I'm going to do a full review on this, so I don't want to talk about it too much in this wrap up, because then I'm going to just not want to repeat what I'm saying in the review. And I also realized that I hadn't done any book reviews this year on my channel, so I want to try to rectify that in December by posting. I think I'm going to try to post 3 book reviews from books that I read this year. So in brief, if you're not into watching book reviews, this is a novel that takes place in New York City in the art scene of the early 1990s, and you follow the character Lou Ryle, who is a photographer, and she lives in a derelict studio building, not really a studio, an old factory that's been converted into studios that are not legal in Brooklyn. And as she's taking self-portraits of herself, she captures something happening behind her outside the window. And this capture, when she sees it, she doesn't know that happens until she develops the photo. And it creates a huge dilemma for her, because she realizes that it's the best work she's ever done. It was completely an accident, and it's captured something that will be devastating to others. So I don't want to reveal too much about the plot, because I think the beauty in the book is not knowing what's going to happen and, going through those emotional moral dilemmas while you're reading it. So I'll leave it there. If you want to hear a bit more about why I liked it and all the things about it that I think it did really well, then please watch the review video, which may or may not be up. And if it is up, I will link it down below. And I'll check in again when I have finished another book. Hey everyone. I just finished The Savage River, 71 Days with Simon Fraser by Marjorie Wilkins Campbell. This was written in the 1960s, and it is meant to be a young adult Canadian history book. And I think overall it accomplishes what it sets out to do, which is to chronicle the journey that Simon Fraser took north to south down the river that now bears his name in British Columbia. Because of the time that it was published in, it doesn't really use correct terminology for a lot of the Indigenous First Nations groups that Fraser encounters. It also uses the term Indians. And I think a lot of the way the story's told has a bit of a bias. There's a few biases in here that I think make the way the story is told a bit hard to... You kind of have to read it with a bit of a realization that it's not depicting a lot of the Indigenous groups probably correctly or with the right lens. So it's very much, a white lens of a very difficult journey down a really wild and rapid-filled river. The whole point of Simon Fraser's journey was to try to discover a way to connect the east to the west of Canada, and so he did that. He discovered that this river was not navigable. Like, you couldn't use a canoe to transport goods along this river because it was too difficult to navigate it. It was too wild. There were too many rapids. It was too extreme of a river. It covers a lot of ground, thousands of miles. So, and he knew of another river, the Columbia River, which is lower down, which was discovered by another, or which was, I shouldn't use the word discovered, which was mapped by Alexander Mackenzie previously. So he knew this was a different river. He knew it wasn't the Columbia. He knew that it reached the sea, but it wasn't a good transport route. And so overall, this mission was kind of just, it was considered a failure because they didn't find a navigable route to get to the ocean, which is interesting because it wasn't about, mapping the river. It was about finding ways to get furs to the West Coast. So, it was really interesting to read. And I think that, these types of books are important in terms of their marking something, because Simon Fraser was not really lauded as an explorer, I guess, in the white men explorer hierarchy. He was not high up there, despite the fact that he did this work. So, I don't necessarily feel upset about that, or like, I don't know. It's kind of a weird thing to do, because when you're looking through a lens and you're trying to understand colonial history, the motivations for something like this are important, but also devastating on so many levels. Because what happened to this land, to these people, to the indigenous people as they went along. And then I don't know if I'm supposed to feel bad for Simon Fraser that he didn't receive as much recognition as some of these other men. But then, the recognition of these men was not, they were doing something that was important to the advancement of Western civilization, but like, I don't know. It hurt so many people. So it's a very strange thing to kind of judge. I do think this book is an accessible read, but it would have to be read with the understanding of when it was written and the terminology and the perspectives that it's sharing, as opposed to what could be shared now in a different lens. So that's my review of The Savage River. Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you know about my last kind of finish of November. And I just want to be perfectly honest. I didn't read this book cover to cover. Rivers of Power by Laurence C. Smith. How a natural force raised kingdoms, destroys civilizations, and shapes our world. So this is obviously nonfiction. This is very extensive exploration of how rivers have formed who we are as humans, and how our living beside them and using them for, creating hydropower, using them for fish farming, using them for delineating borders, all these types of things, how that influences, how they influence us, and how we in turn affect them environmentally as well. So the book is goes into a lot of detail. I really enjoyed some of the historical aspects. They talk about the River Nile and kind of the first kind of river technology that was developed in ancient Egypt, and the way the Nile would flood every year and would allow the plains to then be planted for food, and the kind of cyclical way that was approached was super interesting. There was also information about like a whole chapter about wars and different wars, and how rivers were strategically used in different ways to win battles, or to advance colonization, lots of things like that. So it's very detailed, and for me there was just more detail than I needed or wanted to read. But I think that if you were looking for something very comprehensive that covers rivers, from everywhere everywhere from geological to political to social, environmental aspects of rivers, then I think this book is really comprehensive and a really good choice for your nonfiction reading. So this was my last read of November, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back again soon with another video.